The river ran fast that afternoon. It had rained hard for 3 days straight, and the water had turned brown and thick, dragging broken branches along with it. Elowen walked along the bank with a basket on her arm. She'd come to gather wild mint for her mother's tea. The smell of wet earth hung heavy in the air, and her boots sank a little with every step. She could hear the rush of the water, and somewhere behind the trees, a crow calling. The wind tugged at her bonnet, and she reached up to hold it in place. She was 3 miles from the village of Fenmore, 7 miles from any grand house, and she was, as always, alone. She liked it that way. Her mother worried about that. Her mother worried about a lot of things. Her father didn't worry at all. He was too busy pretending the family wasn't poor. Elowen bent down and picked a handful of mint. The leaves felt cool and slightly rough between her fingers, and the smell rose up the moment she crushed one. She tucked them into her basket and moved on. Then she heard the shout. It was small, a boy's voice, coming from the bend in the river, where the current ran fastest, and the bank fell away sharp. She froze, listened. The shout came again, higher this time, thinner. She dropped the basket and ran. Her skirt caught on a bramble. She yanked it free and it tore. She didn't stop. The mud pulled at her boots. She didn't stop. Her bonnet slipped back off her head, and the wind took her hair, and still she didn't stop. When she rounded the bend, she saw him, a boy, small, maybe 7, maybe 8, caught in the middle of the river, the current hauling him along. His head went under, then came back up. His arms beat at the water like a bird with a broken wing. He wasn't screaming anymore. He was too tired to scream. Elowen didn't think. She kicked off her boots, pulled the tie of her cloak, threw it to the ground, took 3 running steps, and jumped. The cold hit her like a slap. The breath left her body in one hard rush, and the current seized her at once. But she'd known this river her whole life. She knew how it moved, where the deep pockets sat, where the roots of the old willow reached out beneath the surface like fingers. She didn't swim straight for the boy. She swam ahead of him, angling with the current, letting the river carry him toward her instead. He hit her fast. She caught his coat with one hand. His face was white, his lips blue, his eyes half shut. She pulled him against her chest and kicked hard for the bank, for the willow. She needed the willow. She twisted in the water, found the long, low branch hanging out over the current, and grabbed it. The bark bit into her palm. She held on. Her arm burned. Her legs kicked slower and slower, and the boy hung heavy against her, his small heart beating fast through his soaked coat. "Please," she whispered, not sure who she was whispering to. She only knew that if she let go, they'd both go under. Hand over hand, she dragged them to the bank. She hauled him up onto the wet grass and collapsed beside him, turned him onto his side. He coughed, coughed again. River water spilled from his mouth. He gasped, and then he began to cry. Elowen cried too, but only for a moment. Then she stopped. Crying wasn't useful. She pushed her wet hair out of her face, pulled him into her lap, and wrapped her arms around him. "You're safe now," she said, her voice shaking. "You're safe." He trembled against her, teeth chattering, his whole small body cold as stone. She rubbed his back, his arms, murmuring his safety over and over into his wet hair. "What's your name?" she asked, once his breathing had slowed. "Rowan," he whispered. "Rowan," she repeated. "That's a very good name." He turned his face into her shoulder. He smelled of the river, and underneath that, something clean, soap scented with lavender. His clothes, torn and soaked as they were fine. The buttons on his coat were silver. She noticed that now. She didn't care whose son he was. She only cared that he was breathing. She lifted him, heavier than he looked, and staggered a step before finding her footing. She wrapped him in her cloak, left the basket and her boots behind, and walked barefoot through the mud toward home, holding him close. Her mother screamed when she saw them at the door. "Not me," Elowen said. "Him. Warm water. Blankets, now." Her mother was a small woman, but she moved fast when it mattered. She set water to boil and stripped every blanket from the beds. Elowen peeled the wet clothes off the boy and wrapped him in wool by the fire. Slowly, his color came back. He fell asleep against her shoulder. Her father came in from the yard. He looked at the boy. He looked at the fine little coat drying by the fire, the silver buttons catching the light. He looked at his daughter, still in her wet dress, hair still dripping, feet bare and cut from the walk. "Whose child is that?" he asked. "I don't know," Elowen said. Her father knelt by the fire and picked up the coat, turning it over. Stitched into the inside of the collar, in dark thread, was a crest, a wolf's head, between two stars. He went very still. "What is it?" her mother asked. "Thornwick," her father said quietly. "That's the crest of the House of Thornwick." Elowen didn't move. The boy slept on, his breath warm and even against her neck. The House of Thornwick, the Duke of Thornwick, the man whose offer she had refused. She had never met him. That was the truth of it. She had never once stood in the same room as the Duke of Thornwick. But 6 months earlier, a letter had arrived. A formal one. Her father had opened it with shaking hands. The Duke had lost his wife 3 years before. He had a young son. He wished to marry again. Not for love, the letter said plainly, but for the good of the boy and the good of the house. He'd been given her name by a mutual acquaintance, and he'd made his offer. That offer would have saved her family. Her father had made sure she understood that. There were debts, creditors, a mortgage on the farm that would come due within the year. The Duke's settlement would have cleared every debt and left her mother comfortable for the rest of her life. Elowen had said no, quietly, once. "I won't marry a man I've never met," she'd told them, "whose feelings toward me can't exist because he doesn't know me, and whose feelings about his own life are cold enough that he can put a price on a wife in a letter." Her father had shouted. Her mother had cried. Elowen had gone up to her small room and shut the door, and hadn't opened it again for 2 days. Then she'd come down and gone on with her life. Her father had written the refusal, and no one had spoken of it since. The debts kept growing. The farm kept failing. But she had said no, and she'd meant it. Now his son was asleep in her arms. "He has to be returned," her father said, low, "tonight." "Look at him," Elowen said. "He can barely stand. He's not going anywhere tonight." "Elowen, he's not going anywhere tonight." Her voice stayed quiet, but it was firm. The same voice she'd used 6 months before. Her father heard it and stopped. Her mother sent word to the great house by way of the boy who tended the pigs. "A short note. Your son is safe. He's at Hollowbrook Farm, warm and sleeping. Send a carriage in the morning, if it pleases you." Elowen didn't sign it. That night, she sat by the fire and watched the boy sleep. Her mother had made her change, out of the wet dress. Her feet were bandaged, her hands raw from the willow bark. She was exhausted down to her bones, but she watched him breathe. She thought about how strange life was, about how the river had run high because of 3 days of rain, about going for mint that afternoon instead of the morning, about the crow going quiet at just the right moment. Change one small thing, and he would have drowned, and she would never have known. She thought about his father, whom she'd never met. She wondered what kind of man let his little boy wander alone by a swollen river. Then she was too tired to think any more, and she fell asleep in the chair. The carriage arrived at dawn. Elowen heard it before she saw it. 4 horses moving fast on the wet road. She stood too quickly, feet aching, and went to the window. The carriage was black, unmarked, but the horses were matched greys, and the driver wore fine livery. It stopped in the yard. A man stepped out. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. Tall, and he carried himself like a man who never had to try. His coat was black, his hair dark, and even from the window she could see the hardness in his face. Not cruelty, hardness like stone that had sat in a river a long time. He studied the small farmhouse, studied the door, and walked toward it. Elowen turned from the window. "Papa," she said, "please, let me speak with him." Her father looked at her, the same father who'd shouted for 2 days over the refused offer, who'd begged her to reconsider, and who now understood, more clearly than any of them, exactly who was walking to his door. "Elowen," he said, "do you know what you're doing?" "No," she admitted, "but he's my guest whether he knows it or not, and Rowan is my patient." Her father opened the door. The Duke didn't bow. Dukes don't bow to farmers, but he removed his hat, which was more than his rank required. He stepped inside without asking. He filled the small front room, carrying with him the smell of cold morning air, horses, leather, faint smoke, and something clean underneath it all. "Where's my son?" he said. "By the fire," Elowen answered. "Sleeping." He turned his head and saw her for the first time. His eyes were grey, the colour of the river the day before, running full and cold. They rested on her face a moment too long, and she felt the weight of it. It was the look of a man who missed nothing. He said nothing to her. He crossed to the fire and knelt beside the small shape wrapped in wool and pressed a hand to his son's forehead. He kept it there. His shoulders dropped, just slightly. She wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't been watching. The boy stirred.
"Papa?"
"I'm here." "I fell in the water." "I know. The lady pulled me out." His hand didn't move. "I know that too. You're safe now." The boy sighed, turned his face into his father's palm, and slept again. The Duke stayed like that a long time, head bowed, hand still. Elowen looked away. She felt like she was seeing something she wasn't meant to see. Her mother, who'd been standing by the door twisting her apron, slipped quietly into the kitchen. Her father followed. Elowen was alone in the room with the Duke and his sleeping son. At last, he stood and turned to her. "Your name?" "Elowen Ashworth." He went still. She watched it happen, watched something click into place behind his eyes. "Ashworth," he said aloud, as if testing it. "You're the one who sent me a very polite letter of refusal 6 months ago." "Yes." The room went quiet. The fire crackled. The old clock in the corner ticked. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted and blew air through its nose. "I see," the Duke said. "You couldn't have known," she said. "There's no reason you would. I wasn't the one who signed the letter." "No," she said. "You weren't." She didn't know what to say to that, so she looked at the floor instead, suddenly aware of her tangled hair, her bandaged bare feet, the mended patches on her old dress. She lifted her chin anyway. "He'll need a doctor," she said. "Not urgently, but soon. His breathing was rough last night. His chest may take harm from the cold. He should be seen." "He's a brave boy," the Duke said, "and a foolish one. He was told not to leave the garden." "He's 8. 8-year-old boys leave gardens. That's what they do." He looked at her, and something moved behind his eyes. Small, easy to miss. "May I ask, Miss Ashworth," he said, "how you came to be at the river? I was gathering mint, and you went into the water." "Yes? You couldn't have known who he was?" "No. You don't swim well. There's no reason a country girl would. I swim well enough for the river I've known all my life." He studied her for so long that heat rose up her neck. She held his gaze anyway. She'd refused his offer without ever meeting him. She wouldn't cower now that she had. "You saved my son's life," he said finally, "and you didn't know he was mine." "No. If I'd known, would it have changed what I did?" The question caught her off guard. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I'd have jumped in for any child, yours or anyone's." He nodded once. Not approval, just acknowledgement, and turned back to his son. "I'll carry him now. The doctor will be at the house within the hour. I owe you." He paused, as if weighing the word. "I owe your family a great deal." "You owe us nothing, Your Grace." She said it as evenly as she could. "A child fell in a river. I pulled him out. Any decent person would have done the same. Don't put a price on it. Don't send a purse. If you must repay this, teach your son to stay away from the water when it's running high." He looked at her again. She saw him consider a reply, and then decide against it. He bent, gathered his son into his arms, the boy weighing nothing against his chest, and stood. "Good day, Miss Ashworth. Good day, Your Grace." He walked out. The door shut behind him. The horses clattered across the yard, and the carriage pulled away. Elowen stood by the fire and listened until the last sound of the wheels had faded. Then her legs gave out, and she sat down hard and began to shake. She didn't know why. The danger was over. The boy was safe. The Duke was gone. She was home. There was no reason to shake. But she shook for a long time. 2 days passed. The doctor's carriage came and went from the great house. Word traveled, the way it does in small villages, that the Duke's young son had nearly drowned and been pulled from the river by a farmer's daughter. Some said her name, some didn't. Elowen kept to the house. Her feet needed to heal, her arm was sore, and her mother wouldn't let her lift so much as a bucket. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived. Heavy paper, no crest, but she knew the hand at once. She'd seen it before, 6 months ago, on a letter she'd refused. She read it, standing in the yard. "Miss Ashworth, my son wishes to thank the lady who pulled him from the river. He asks for you every morning and every evening, and he will not be quieted. I ask you to visit him. He cannot travel. His chest is still weak from the water. If you're able to come, name your day, and my carriage will fetch you. If you cannot, tell me so, and I will accept your answer. Thornwick." That was all. No offer, no mention of the earlier letter, no suggestion she owed him anything beyond seeing a small boy who wanted to say thank you. She read it twice, folded it, and brought it inside to her mother, who read it and looked up. "Elowen, you have to go." "I know. Do you know why he isn't offering anything more? Because he understands." "Understands what?" "That I don't want anything from him. That I only ever wanted to be treated like a person, not like the answer to a problem. That's why I refused him before. Now he's only asking a small kindness for his son. He's not asking for me." Her mother watched her. The same mother who had cried for 2 days over the refusal, now looking at her daughter with something new in her eyes, something like understanding. "Go, Elowen." "I will." The carriage came for her the next morning. She wore her best dress, which wasn't very fine, and her hair up in a plain knot, and her mother's shawl around her shoulders. She didn't care how she looked. She was going to see a small boy. The great house sat at the end of a long drive lined with old oaks. Pale stone, larger than any building she'd ever stood inside. She'd passed it twice in 17 years, always from the road. She'd never expected to walk through its doors. A butler led her, wordless, through halls that smelled of beeswax and cold flowers. Her footsteps rang against the marble. The chill of the stone crept through her thin shoes. She tried not to stare at the paintings. She tried not to feel small. He brought her to a bedroom upstairs. The curtains were half drawn against the light. Rowan sat up in a great bed, wrapped in shawls, a book open in his lap. When he saw her, he dropped it. "You came." Elowen smiled. She couldn't help it. "I came." He held his arms out, and she went to him, sitting on the edge of the bed while he hugged her hard around the neck. That same faint smell of soap and lavender and clean sheets, and underneath it, just the smell of a small boy. "I told Papa you'd come," he said, pulling back to look at her seriously. His eyes were dark, not grey like his father's. His mother's eyes, maybe. She didn't know. "Are you angry with him?" he asked. "Why would I be angry with your papa?" "Because he sent a letter asking you to marry him, and you said no." She went very still. "Who told you that?" "Papa did. Last night. He said I was old enough to know. He said I might meet you, and I shouldn't say anything foolish. He said you had every right to say no, and he'd been wrong to send a letter like that." "He said that?" "Yes." Rowan considered her again. "I'm not angry with him," she said finally. "Good." He picked up his book. "Will you read to me? The doctor says I have to rest." "Reading counts as resting." "Reading counts as resting," she agreed. "What's the book?" "The Pilgrim's Progress. Papa says I'm too young for it, but I like the pictures." She took the book and began to read, her voice quiet at first, then steadier. Rowan listened with his eyes half closed, the near drowning still visible on him, a pale cast under his skin, a tiredness that hadn't been there before. But he was warm. He was listening. He was safe. She read for an hour. At some point, the door opened behind her. She didn't look up. She kept reading, sensing him at the edge of the room, standing just out of the boy's sight. The Duke, watching, not intruding. She kept reading. When Rowan finally drifted off, she closed the book, sat a moment, then stood and turned. The Duke was leaning in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, arms crossed, watching his sleeping son. When she moved, his eyes came to her. He raised a finger to his lips and tilted his head toward the hall. She followed him out. He led her to a small sitting room, warm from a lit fire, with a tea tray already set on a low table. She realized, suddenly, how thirsty she was. "Please," he said, "sit." She sat. He poured the tea himself, without ringing for a servant, and handed her the cup without their fingers touching. Though he stood close enough that she caught that same faint scent of smoke and leather beneath the clean edge of him. He sat across from her. "Thank you for coming," he said. "He's a sweet boy," she said. "A lonely one." He didn't soften it. He lost his mother when he was 5. He hasn't been the same since. He barely speaks to my sister, who visits often. He says almost nothing to his tutor beyond what's required. He asks for you every morning, Miss Ashworth. I don't know exactly what you did for him at that river, beyond the obvious, but something in him decided about you. She looked down at her tea. "I wrote to you 6 months ago," he said. "It was a cold letter. I meant it to be. I'd been told you were sensible, that you'd understand a practical arrangement, and I believed I was doing you a courtesy, not pretending to feelings I didn't have. I was wrong. You weren't wrong, to be honest. I was wrong to think that naming a business arrangement honestly was the same as naming a person honestly. I wrote to you as though you were a solution, not as a woman with a mind of her own. He looked up at her. You were right to refuse me. I want you to know I understood that the moment your father's letter arrived. I wasn't angry. I was ashamed. I didn't know that, she said quietly. I never told anyone. Why tell me now? Because you're sitting in my house, and you saved my son's life, and I don't want you to leave believing I ever thought of you as less than a person who was entirely right to want more than what I offered. The fire cracked. A log settled. The clock on the mantel ticked on. She looked at the flames because she didn't know where else to look. Thank you, she said finally, for saying that. You don't owe me an answer to it. I know. I'm not asking you to reconsider. I know. I'm only telling you what's true. That's all. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and drank her tea. It burned her tongue slightly, and she was glad of it. He watched her drink, then said, May I ask you something? Yes. Why did you refuse me? Not the practical reasons. Your father wrote those. What was the true one? She thought for a long moment. He waited without pressing. A man, she noticed, who could sit inside a silence without needing to fill it. Because I've watched women marry for money my whole life, she said. Every one of them loses a piece of herself doing it. My mother's cousin married a man she'd met 3 times. He was rich. He was old. She wrote letters home for 2 years, and then she stopped writing, and then she died of a fever, alone in a large house, with no one who loved her anywhere near. I don't want to die alone in a large house, Your Grace. I'd rather live a poor life in a small one, surrounded by people who actually see me. He said nothing. That's why, she said. That's my reason. It's a good one. The fire popped. Somewhere in the house, a door closed, and footsteps faded down a corridor. I'd like to ask you something else, he said. Yes? May I write to you? Simply letters. You may answer or not, as you choose. If you answer, I'll write again. If you don't, I won't trouble you further. I find that I'd like to know you as a person, not as a solution, and not because of what you did at the river. Because I sat in this room and heard you say what you just said, and I've never heard a woman speak so plainly in my life. I'd like to hear it again. She stared at him, unsure what to say. You may refuse, he said. I'm asking, not requiring. Take a day, Miss Ashworth. Take a week. Send word, or send nothing. Both are answers. She stood. She wasn't sure why, only that she needed to be on her feet. He rose at once, but didn't step toward her, keeping a proper distance. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I ask. He walked her through the great house himself, all the way to the door, keeping his distance the whole way. When she was seated in the carriage, he closed the door for her, and she looked back at him through the window. His face was as still as it had been that first morning. Only his eyes moved. She rode home in silence. The letter came 4 days later, short. It described a hawk in his stable yard that had refused to hunt for 6 months and had, that very morning, suddenly taken a partridge. He didn't know why. He thought she might find it interesting. She read it 3 times and wrote back that evening. Her letter was short too. She said hawks were like people. They chose the moments they were willing to be seen. She said her mother's hens had refused the coop for a week last spring and returned to it without explanation. Perhaps the hawk had simply decided to be a hawk again. His next letter arrived within 3 days. That was how it began. The letters came weekly, then twice a week. He wrote about small things, a book he'd read, a tenant's roof he'd had fixed, Rowan's slow return to health, and the small improvements each day brought. She wrote back about the farm, her mother's tea, a stray cat that had shown up at her door and refused to leave. She never mentioned money. He never brought it up either. That subject stayed closed by silent agreement. She saw him twice more that winter, each time visiting Rowan, each time finding the Duke at the edge of the room, watching without intruding. Each time walked to the door and kept at a proper distance. Each time she looked back at him through the carriage window and felt something turn over in her chest that she refused to name. She couldn't afford to name it. He was a duke. She was a farmer's daughter. She had refused his offer of marriage once, and he'd given her his word he wouldn't offer again. He was too proud and too respectful of her refusal to break that word. What they had now was letters, and a recovering boy, and an unspoken agreement to be honest with each other. That was all it could ever be. She had known that from the start. She chose it anyway. Then the trouble came, and it came in the shape of Lady Iseult Fenwick, the Duke's older sister. Elowen had heard the name. Rowan had mentioned her twice. She was the great lady of the family, kept a townhouse in London, and visited Thornwick Hall 4 times a year to do what she called putting things right. She arrived in March. Elowen learned of it when a boy came from the great house carrying a note, not from the Duke this time, but from Lady Iseult. It requested Miss Ashworth's presence for tea, in a tone that wasn't really a request at all. Elowen showed it to her mother, who read it and pressed her mouth into a thin line. "You don't have to go." "I do have to go." "Elowen, she's his sister. She's heard about me. She wants to look at me. I'd rather she look at me sitting in a chair with a cup in my hand than let her think I'm afraid." She went the next afternoon. Lady Iseult was tall and thin, with her brother's grey eyes, though where his were quiet, hers were sharp. She wore a dark green gown that likely cost more than the Ashworth farm produced in a year, and she received Elowen in a small blue drawing room without standing. "Miss Ashworth, sit." Elowen sat. "Tea, please." Lady Iseult poured, hand steady, and passed the cup without meeting Elowen's eyes. She sat back and studied her over the rim of her own cup. "So," she said, "you're the girl who pulled Rowan out of the water." "I am." "And you're the girl who refused my brother." Elowen set her cup down carefully in its saucer. "I am." "That takes a certain kind of nerve, Miss Ashworth, refusing a duke, or a certain kind of self-respect." Lady Iseult's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "You're aware my brother's been writing to you." "I'm aware." "You're aware it's being talked of." "I didn't know that." "Country people talk, Miss Ashworth, and the great house has servants, and servants have families, and letters that travel from a duke to a farmer's daughter every week get noticed. My brother isn't a fool, but he's a man, and men, widowers especially, don't always see clearly. Lady Fenwick, let me." "I'll finish." Elowen closed her mouth. "I've watched my brother mourn his wife for 3 years. I've watched him raise his son alone. I've watched him turn down every reasonable match offered to him. Daughters of earls, daughters of marquises, women who understand exactly what a duke's wife must do and be. And now, in 4 months, he's writing weekly to a girl whose only claim on him is a piece of luck at the edge of a river." She set her cup down and leaned forward. "I want to tell you something, Miss Ashworth, and I want you to hear it clearly, because you strike me as an intelligent girl, and I don't wish to be misunderstood. My brother could marry the daughter of an earl. He could marry the daughter of a marquis. He will not marry a farmer's daughter with a torn shawl and mud on her hem, however much he enjoys her cleverness in a letter. If you believe otherwise, you're more foolish than I took you for. And if you let this correspondence go on, you'll end it the way women in your position always do, with a broken heart, a ruined reputation, and no husband willing to take you afterward. I say this as a kindness. It's not a kindness I owe you. But you saved my nephew's life, so I'll pay you in the only currency I have. The truth. The fire crackled. Elowen looked at her tea and didn't touch it. She thought of the Duke saying I was ashamed. She thought of Rowan saying I told Papa you'd come. She thought of the letter about the hawk. She thought of her mother's cousin, dead alone in a great house. She thought for a long time. Lady Fenwick, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. May I ask you one question in return? You may. Did you love the man you married? Lady Isolde's face didn't change, but her hand tightened on the arm of her chair. That's not your concern, Miss Ashworth. No, it's not. And what your brother writes to me, and what I write back, isn't yours either. She stood. I hear what you've said. I hear it clearly. I know what my station is. I know what his is. I've known both since I was old enough to know anything. I refused his offer of marriage 6 months ago because I wouldn't be the solution to a problem, not because I failed to grasp how wide the gap between us is. I knew. I still know. If your brother writes to me tomorrow, I'll read the letter. If he writes the day after, I'll read that one too. If he stops writing, I won't chase him. But I won't stop reading his letters, because you've told me I should. He's a grown man. I'm a grown woman. If either of us needs stopping, it won't be by you. She set her cup down properly. Thank you for the tea. Lady Isolde stared at her, silent for a long moment. Sit down, Miss Ashworth. No, thank you. I said sit down. And I said no. Elowen's voice stayed quiet. Good day, Lady Fenwick. She walked out. Her legs were shaking, but she didn't let it show. She crossed the great hall and reached the door, and the same butler who'd shown her in showed her out, not meeting her eyes. She thought perhaps he'd heard everything. Country people talk, Lady Isolde had said. So did butlers, apparently. The carriage was still waiting. She climbed in and rode home with her hands folded in her lap, watching the winter fields pass, and she didn't cry, not once. She was certain Lady Isolde would tell her brother. She was certain he'd write, and she didn't know whether he'd side with his sister or whether the letters would simply stop. 2 days passed. No letter. 4 days. No letter. A week. No letter. On the 9th day, she went to the river. It wasn't the same river as before. The water had dropped low, and the willow's branch, the one that had saved her, hung dry above the current now. She sat on the bank and didn't gather anything. She just sat. She thought about how strange it was that she'd chosen a hard truth over a soft lie, and how that truth now sat like a stone in her chest. She'd done the right thing. She was sure of that. She'd refused to let anyone tell her what she could and couldn't read, and she'd defended her own dignity. And now the letters had stopped, and she didn't know if it was because Lady Isolde had spoken to him or because Lady Isolde had been right all along, and he'd quietly come around to it and set her aside, the way a duke can set aside anything he chooses. She sat by the river a long time. The sun was low when she finally stood, and she was startled to see a tall grey horse standing at the edge of the wood, reins looped over a low branch, its rider waiting beside it. Cassian! She stopped walking. He wasn't dressed for a visit, a heavy riding coat, mud on his boots, his hair disordered from the ride. He looked like he hadn't slept. Miss Ashworth, he said. Your Grace. He looked at her for a long moment. My sister told me what she said to you. She thought I should know. She thought I'd agree with her. And do you? No. The wind moved through the bare branches. A crow called somewhere far off. Elowen stood very still. "I haven't written this week," he said, "because I didn't trust myself to write anything but what my sister would approve of, and I didn't want to send a letter pretending nothing had changed. Something has changed. I've known it for months. I didn't want to speak of it, because I gave you my word I wouldn't offer again, and you have my word. Then keep it. That's what I'm here to do," he said. "I'm not here to offer you anything. I gave you my word, and I'll keep it. I'm here to tell you I've thought about what my sister said, thought about what she was right about, and what she was wrong about. She's right that people are talking, right that if I married you, some would call it a scandal, right that a duke's wife carries duties that would fall hard on a woman not raised to them. And what was she wrong about? Everything else? About who you are, about what you're worth, about what would break if I asked, and what wouldn't." He stopped, jaw working. "I've kept my word, Miss Ashworth. I haven't asked. I won't ask. But I won't stop writing to you either, unless you tell me to. That's what I came to say." She looked at him. The grey horse blew air through its nose. The sun was nearly gone, and the cold was rising up out of the ground. "Your Grace," she said, her voice coming out soft. "May I say something? Please. I've been sitting by this river all afternoon, thinking about my mother's cousin, the one who died in the large house. I told you about her. I remember. I told you I didn't want to be her. I still don't. But she didn't die because she married a rich man. She died because she married a man who never wrote to her, who never sat in a room with her and asked her a question and waited for the answer, who never once told her he'd done something wrong and been ashamed of it. He didn't speak. I've been thinking," she said, "that I confused two things when I refused you. I thought I was refusing rank, but I was refusing loneliness. Those aren't the same thing. I don't know," she went on, quieter still, "what it would be like to be your wife. I don't know if I could learn what a duchess must know. I don't know if the country's gossip would break me, or if your sister will ever look at me as anything but a mistake. There's a great deal I don't know. There's a great deal I don't know either," he said. "But I know," she said, "that I've read every letter you've sent me. I know that when a week passed without one, I felt it. I know I sat by this river today, and I wasn't sad about the river. I was sad about you. That's what I know." He took one step toward her and stopped there. "You told me," he said carefully, "that I wasn't to ask. You're not to ask. Then, I'm telling you," she said, "that if you were to ask, my answer wouldn't be the same as it was 6 months ago." The wood went very quiet. She could hear his breath, and her own, and the small sound of the horse pulling at a patch of grass. The cold pressed against her face. Her heart was so loud she thought he must be able to hear it too. He didn't move. He stood there in the last of the light, mud on his boots, hair disordered, coat too heavy for the season, and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. "May I ask you now?" he said. "Yes." "Elowen," he said her name like he was testing whether he was allowed to. "Will you marry me? Not because it saves your family, not because it settles any debt, not because it gives my son a mother, though I won't pretend that isn't part of it. Because I've written you 37 letters, and I've read every one you've sent back until the paper wore thin, and I don't want to write to you anymore. I want to sit in the same room and ask you a question, and wait for the answer." She didn't answer right away. She let the moment stretch, looked at him, at the grey horse, at the dark trees, at the sky turning purple behind him. She thought of her mother, who had cried for 2 days, her father, who had shouted, Lady Isolde, and the tea, and the words broken heart, and ruined reputation, and no husband willing to take you. She thought of the river, and the small blue face, and the willow branch, and her own whispered pleading to no one in particular. She thought of Rowan saying, "I told Papa you'd come." "Yes," she said. "Yes, Cassian." He crossed the ground between them in 3 steps. He didn't sweep her up. He didn't kiss her. He stopped 1 step away and took her hand between both of his, warm against her cold fingers, and held it there a long moment, looking down at the small scars along her palm from the willow bark, the knuckle she'd scraped on a stone the day before, the plain, worked hands of a girl who labored for a living. He didn't speak. He simply held her hand. Then he lifted it and pressed his mouth, very lightly, to the back of her fingers. "Come," he said, setting it back down. "You're cold. Ride back with me. I'll speak to your father tonight." He lifted her onto the grey horse and mounted behind her. She could feel the warmth of him through his coat, catch the smell of smoke and leather beneath it. The horse walked slow along the wood road. Neither of them spoke. She thought that in her whole life she had never been so quiet and so happy all at once. They married in the small stone church at Fenmore. More people crowded into it than the building had ever held. Her mother wept. Her father, who had shouted 6 months before, couldn't stop smiling. Rowan carried the ring, dropped it once, picked it up with great seriousness, and didn't smile once through the whole ceremony, because he'd been told it was a solemn duty. Lady Airsault was there too, in dark red, seated in the 2nd row. When the vows were spoken, she watched Elowen with a face that gave nothing away. Later, at the small reception at Thornwick Hall, she approached with a glass in hand. "Duchess," "Lady Fenwick, I said a great many things to you in that drawing room. I don't take them back. I didn't expect you to." Lady Iseult studied her. For the first time, her eyes weren't sharp. "But I was wrong about one thing." "Which?" "About who you were." She drank from her glass. "Welcome to the family." She walked away and never mentioned it again. She never grew warm, exactly. She wasn't built for warmth. But she was, in her own hard way, kind after that. When a gossiping baroness tried to make a fool of Elowen at a London ball 3 months later, Lady Iseult cut the woman dead in front of 6 witnesses and made certain everyone in the room knew whose side she stood on. That was her way, and Elowen learned to be grateful for it. There was one more thing Elowen learned that first year, quite by accident, in the autumn. She was walking through the village and stopped at the cottage of an old woman named Mrs. Colvin, whose shepherd husband had passed and who lived alone now. Mrs. Colvin had been kind to Elowen as a child. Elowen brought her a basket of apples and sat with her by the fire for an hour. As she rose to leave, Mrs. Colvin caught her hand. "Your Grace, before you go, I've wanted to tell you about the roof." "The roof?" "This one, on the cottage. It leaked terribly last winter. I couldn't afford to mend it, and I couldn't face another winter with the wet coming through. I was going to have to go live with my daughter up north, and I didn't want to leave this place. My husband's buried in the yard behind it. I didn't want to be far from him." "What happened?" "In November, a man came, said he'd been sent to fix the roof. I asked who'd sent him. He wouldn't say. Mended it in 3 days, wouldn't take a penny, said the cost was already paid, and went on his way. I asked around the village who'd done it. Nobody would say. But there was a boy, Sam, from the Thornwick stables, who mentioned he'd ridden with the Duke that autumn, and the Duke had stopped in this very lane and looked at the cottage a long while. He'd asked Sam which roof it was that leaked. Elowen went very still. "He never told you," Mrs. Colvin said. "No, I didn't think he had. He's not a man who tells. She tightened her grip on Elowen's hand. I wanted you to know what kind of man you married. Not the one they talk about in London. The one who fixes an old woman's roof in a village he doesn't live in, and tells no one. Elowen walked home along the lane. She didn't cry. It wasn't that kind of feeling. She didn't run either. She just walked and thought. She didn't mention it that night, or the next week. She brought it up quietly one evening in December, the two of them by the fire, Rowan asleep upstairs, snow falling soft against the tall windows. Cassian. Mrs. Colvin's roof. He didn't look up from his book. What of it? You mended it. I paid a man to mend it. You mended it. That's not the same thing. You never told me. It wasn't important. She looked at him. He was still reading, or pretending to. It was important to her, she said. He turned a page and didn't answer. Cassian. Thank you. He looked up then, and his grey eyes carried that same weight they'd had the first morning in her mother's front room. Softer now, but the same. You're welcome, my love, he said, and went back to his book. She sat with her tea and watched the fire and the snow and the man she had once refused in a letter she never regretted, because if she'd said yes back then, she would never have found herself here, in this quiet, in this warmth, in this understanding that had grown up slowly between them. In time, Rowan grew strong. He rode a small brown pony badly, and then well. He laughed often. He called her Elowen, and then one spring day, when he was 10, he called her Mama, without seeming to notice he'd said it. She didn't correct him. She made no fuss of it, only knelt and kissed the top of his head as he ran past her into the garden. He never called her anything else again. The river at Fenmore still ran, high some springs and low in others. Elowen walked along it sometimes, when she visited her mother, and always stopped at the bend where the willow leaned low over the water. She'd touch the bark of the branch that had once held her, and think of the small blue face and the whispered pleading and the long climb up the bank. She'd think of how she'd said no to a letter and yes to a man, and how, in the end, those had been the very same kind of yes all along. Yes to being seen, yes to being known, yes to the small, hard truths a life gets built from, one after another, like stones laid into a wall. Then she'd walk home along the lane and see smoke rising from the chimney of the great house at the end of the drive, and find him waiting at the door, not because it was his duty, but because he'd heard her coming and chosen to be there. That was the story. That was all of it.